Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Hello, everybody. This is Carter Froelich, and welcome to the Land to Lots podcast. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to the stage, to the podcast, David Oliver. And David is a partner with Allen Boone Humphreys Robinson and is also the chairman of the firm's executive committee. David's practice at ABHR is focused on development with an emphasis on the acquisition and financing of critical infrastructure necessary to serve master plan communities, commercial, and mixed-use projects. David's primary role is as general and/or bond counsel for special purpose local governments, MUDs, MMDs, that provide water, sewer, drainage, roads, and parks across the Houston MSA. And if you're developing in Texas and haven't heard of David or ABHR, then probably you haven't been in Texas very long, because they are household names. So David, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time. And, obviously today we're going to be talking about special purpose taxing districts in Texas. And if possible, I'd like to focus the primary conversation on MUDs, if that's okay with you. So with that, I'd just like to say hello and welcome.
Well, hello, and thank you, Carter. It's a pleasure to join you today, and I certainly appreciate all those kind words. Not sure they're all warranted, but we'll certainly take them. And delighted to visit, and happy to talk primarily about MUDs, because they're near and dear to my heart, and I spend a lot of time with them. So, sounds like a great plan.
Great. Well, before we get started, maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got in to practicing law as it relates to the special purpose taxing districts, because I'm sure in high school that probably wasn't top of mind while you were planning your career.
Yeah. So it's funny you say that. Give you a little bit of my background. I actually, in addition to having a law degree, I have an LLM, or a master's in law and taxation, federal income taxation. And when I started practicing law, I actually practiced used my tax background and was in a transactional practice where I focused primarily on mergers and acquisitions, leverage buyouts, structured finance, and with lots of tax implications, and also, certainly worked with involved in some transactions or tax exempt entities. And then, as a lot of people are familiar with, there are lots of conduit financings and other things that where there are tax exempt plays. But to your point, most people don't go to law school, and certainly don't grow up thinking I'm going to be a MUD lawyer when I grow up. And we kid about that a lot. We generally, most if not all the folks in our practice are, recovering lawyers from some other background. There is, I think people are familiar with sort of more traditional public finance backgrounds, counties, cities, and sort of, typical, ports, and other things, special sports authority type things that finance stadiums or student housing, institutions of higher education, school districts. And really, so there are those who do start out in that realm, and we have a couple, and then sort of migrate into our world. And our world, I would tell you, is very similar. When you ask how I migrated, I was, doing a lot of just transactional practice. And the thing that was, that you sort of miss is that you're doing a lot of paper transactions, which are high value, and, Wall Street Journal or, other visibility, sort of high visibility. And as someone told me, when I was exploring this practice, those things are all in the Wall Street Journal. Most of our practice things are, in the city and state page of the local newspaper. And that was what was actually attractive, is, what we do, and to kind of get to the gut of how we do what we're going to talk about today, is we help build communities, and or rebuild communities. And so what we really do, it's about infrastructure. And that was what was appealing to me, was sort of taking my technical expertise and developing relationships. I mean, the communities we work on and in, sometimes it's a career, or it's at least a 10-year relationship. And then just with the development of the project. And so to to work on something that literally starts out as a rice field or a forest and see it develop into a master plan community, and to be involved in all the planning and infrastructure, design, construction, financing. And we really do get involved very early on to help with the planning to make sure everything, comports with the law. That was what was appealing, is sort of, the technical legal side of it, marrying the technical legal side of it with the guts of making sure that the infrastructure that drives people's lives gets done, and gets done right, and gets done well.
Well, and just from everything that's going on in Houston, I mean, just the rings of growth and all the master plan communities, when you're looking at the top 50, the majority of them are in the Houston, well, they're in Texas, they're in Florida, and the majority of those in Texas are in the Houston area. And so, getting back to the topic, we're going to be talking about MUDs, municipal utility districts. And perhaps for our listeners that are not practicing developing in Texas, obviously the majority of them, I believe, have heard about a MUD. But could you give us a high level description of what a MUD is and how it functions and what it can finance?
Yeah, sure I can. And so a MUD is a municipal utility district, and the municipal utility district is a political subdivision of the state of Texas. It is authorized. They are authorized under the Texas Constitution under Article 16, Section 59. We hear the term MUD, and a MUD is actually a more specific type of water district. And water districts have been around in Texas since the late 1800s, authorized by the Constitution, and then evolved over time to really meet the needs of the state and the economy. And so for the first, call it 50 plus years, they were used largely for agrarian purposes, to organize, to provide water for agriculture, and or to provide drainage to prevent flooding, mainly of crop fields. But then as civilization progressed, more and more for residential and I'll say community drainage, or urban drainage. And so municipal utility districts are a statutory evolution. What they used to have are water control and improvement districts, which are not water control and improvement districts, so you can scratch that. What they used to have were irrigation districts, and they've evolved over time, ultimately leading in the 70s, I guess late 60s and 70s, into the codification in the Texas Water Code of municipal utility districts. And municipal utility districts originally started out being able to finance water, sanitary sewer, and then drainage facilities. We'll probably talk a little later, but then they have evolved over time to now being able to finance roads and parks and recreational facilities. There's some other incidental things that they can pay for, and we'll talk about that probably in a subsequent question. But that's really what they are: water, sewer, drainage, roads, park and recreational facilities.
Okay. And how are the MUDs controlled? Because that's going to become an important discussion topic as we go forward.
And that's a great question. MUDs are controlled by a board of directors. They are elected public officials, and they are subject to the same rules and regulations that other public officials in Texas. And we kind of kid that MUD directors are, some of the most regulated, if not the most regulated in the state. Notwithstanding what you may hear. And so, in Texas or under the statutes, you either have to, own property or live/be registered to vote within the boundaries of the municipal utility district. Obviously, early on, the MUD is there's no development. I mean, MUDs by definition almost are created over raw undeveloped land with no residents. And so in order to qualify folks to do that, the developer sells property to what are known as sort of temporary directors. And then those directors are appointed by the TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, who has oversight of the district. And then they serve, and really they serve just like any other public official. Their terms, they serve 4-year staggered terms, and they are elected. Now, understand that early on in the development cycle, there usually aren't any residents. And then over time, as residents move in, and you go through the cycle, and people are elected to the board, or people move into the community and want to serve and get interested in sort of grassroots politics. They choose to run for the board, and they can be elected. It's very interesting, though. I mean, I think as long as the service in a utility service and sort of quality of homes, quality of the community, and the maintenance of the utility system are good, and the original board are good stewards of the tax rate and of rates. You don't see a lot of turnover early, because people are sort of okay. They moved into a new community and everything's working the way it should, and the rates are where they started. And I think that's a big important part of it is your tax rates, your water and sewer rates aren't spiking. They're staying flat, and or over time, frankly, the tax rates start to trend downward, which is unique. And I'll say that I'm going to compare, which I know is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Cities do not control the mud. They are the city council, the county. They don't have jurisdiction to tell the mud what to do. Cities can, when a mud is created by state law, they have the right to impose conditions on the mud. We call those consent conditions, and those consent conditions can speak to certain things that are enumerated in the statute, like, for example, how long the maturity can be on your debt, at what interest rate you can sell the debt, things like that. Do your plans and specifications for facilities have to be approved by the city? Mm-hmm. And those are all done because the ultimate plan, when they started, the game plan was that MUDs would build the facilities, sell bonds to pay for the facilities, and then over time, as the debt was paid off and the tax rate went down, the city would annex the municipal utility district, dissolve it after the developer's been paid off, been reimbursed fully, and then that system gets incorporated into the city system. And so what the consent conditions were really thought at the time were to make sure that, MUDs weren't issuing debt that made it infeasible in out years to annex the MUD economically, and to make sure that if and when a MUD were annexed by a city, that that the MUD's utility system could be neatly folded into and added to the city system. Mm-hmm. So that's really the thinking behind that. What I would tell you is over time, in a lot of these instances, cities are not annexing MUDs, and there are any number of reasons. Some of them are political, some of them are practical, and so just a variety of reasons.
No, that's great. And there's so many different avenues we could go just on that response.
Yeah, they really are.
And we could turn this into a master's course, I'm sure. But it has, and you alluded to it, so the MUDs have their origin, if you will, with the irrigation districts in the 1800s. I know Texas, just like every other place, has gone through different economic cycles. And have the MUD laws changed at all as a result of, downward trending economic times in the state of Texas? I thought there had been some tweaks to the law, maybe in the 80s or late 70s. And could you just enumerate?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question, an important question, actually, as to, I think, one of the reasons why MUDs are very prevalent today, and actually found more and more success in the last 30 years. And I say it's a prevalence and then also success. So going back to your question at a real high level, originally these water districts were conceived, and there still are, by the way, in the water code, there's a section on water districts. MUDs are a specific provision. There are others, most of which whose time has passed because the use isn't there anymore, and really the MUD has just become a superior, more well-developed, well-known tool. But what happened was, like I said, they were water districts that were used for irrigation and agricultural purposes. What happened, which is what we all do, is over time, as new needs arose, people pushed and pulled and wedged other types of projects into water districts. So you did see in the 50s and 60s people using some of what were intended to be agricultural, water districts. They started fitting them into residential development, sort of the post-war boom as housing needs came up. And when you started getting outside of areas where potable water supply was available, you saw people pushing and pulling. Well, the problem is that those statutes were sort of ill-equipped to handle the demands and needs that a residential and even commercial development at the time called for. And that's what led to the development of the municipal utility district. The MUD statute was something that was a water district geared really more towards residential and commercial development. And what we think of as urban development. I think that's the best way to refer to it. And so anyway, municipal utility districts came in. They started being used pretty regularly in the 60s and then the 70s. And actually, I shouldn't say that, in the late 60s and then 70s. And then the 80s happened. And for those who aren't familiar, what was happening was there weren't a lot of rules and regulations. It was create the water district. It had these financing, it had these capabilities like levying a tax, for example, and you move on down the road. And what happens is you find yourself in the 80s where development was fast and furious. The needs were great. There was a lot of housing demand because of the oil boom. And of course, with that, when there are no rules, people start lending and start speculating. And you had a lot of loans out on land and a lot of lots to try to meet that booming need. And in order to finance some of the infrastructure, as soon as the developer put the stuff in the ground, you basically had bonds issued. They were all land bonds. In some instances, you didn't have streets. You didn't have, developed lots. And when the savings and loans crisis happened, and overnight, you went from a 3-month housing supply to a 30-year housing supply because there was zero economy. You ended up with utility districts, MUDs, that were in distress on their outstanding debt. And of course, it doesn't happen overnight, but it does because, I think people listening to this podcast and familiar with municipal finance overall is you have bonds that are out for 30 years. And so you only have interest and principal payments once a year, interest payments twice a year. And so you really don't go into default until you don't make one of those payments, right? And so it took, in many instances, some were able, and many folks were able to sort of raise their taxes, raise their utility rates, and meet their obligations. But in those situations where there were raw land debt, and there's really no one to tax or anyone to charge fees to, you ended up with situations where we had some districts that had to file for bankruptcy. That actually happened, the crisis happened in the late 80s, but there was a method to my madness just a second ago in explaining how this works. You really didn't see those bankruptcy filings in a couple of MUDs, and we did have a few MUDs, not many, but 5 or 6 that filed for bankruptcy protection in the early 90s. And that led to really a rewriting of the water code, and also to giving jurisdiction to the review of bond applications and bonds sold by MUDs to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, referred to as TCEQ. Now, at the time, that was the Texas Water Commission, and then it morphed into the Texas Natural Resource Counseling Commission. Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission, and that was TNRCC. Then later, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Today, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. But what it did was the laws changed. There were some changes to the water code, and then there were rules pursuant to the water code. There were administrative rules adopted under which the TCEQ and its regulator oversight role was to review and apply to MUDs and their bond issues. And we call those the TCEQ rules, and those specific are usually what you think of as economic feasibility rules. And really, I think there are really 2 sets of rules, even though most people refer to economic feasibility. They're really the TCEQ feasibility rules. And what they're designed to do is make sure if you're undertaking a financing for water, sewer, drainage, and park issues, I'll come back to that, but the TCEQ actually doesn't have jurisdiction over road bonds. They do over your tax rate, which includes road bond financings, but in terms of your bond applications and the actual financings, they only have a jurisdiction over water, sewer, drainage, and parks. And what they do is, one, they look to make sure that are the facilities constructed, were the plans all approved by the appropriate agencies? Or are they constructed in accordance with those plans? Have all the contractors been paid? Have all the facilities been accepted? Have they been inspected by the TCEQ? There's this whole list of, and I call those the engineering feasibility rules, which is to make sure that you have, appropriate municipal standard facilities on the ground. And really what we're talking about is those were intended to make sure that, well, as I alluded to earlier, you don't have scenarios where bonds are being sold and you don't have lots on the ground, because that's really what the collateral is to a bondholder. And really what the future is developed lots with streets and utilities. So then builders can put vertical improvements on there, develop the community, which then creates the tax base and revenue stream that will pay the bonds off. So that's the engineering feasibility. The economic feasibility is really how they measure the transaction itself, and how are the bonds structured? What is the security for the bonds? And by that, I mean the taxable base. What is the proposed tax rate? They do all those sorts of things. And there are details about the bond structure, et cetera. It can't be longer than a certain maturity. And it's, is the interest rate reasonable? I mean, if you're in a 7% interest rate climate and your pro forma says it's 1% bond interest, well, okay, that's not realistic and appropriate. They're not going to approve that because you're not going to be able to sell it. So it's a farce. And of course, nobody submits those, but you have to check for that, right? And so that's really what their role is, to make sure the facilities are there and they're done the way they're supposed to do and they're complete, that you have lots, and then also to make sure that the economic transactions being proposed, the financing, stays within certain parameters. And those are designed to provide certainty and predictability. And I would tell you, they were really designed to address and avoid the problems that the 80s created. And for 30 years since then, the market has grown. And from a market where you had some bankruptcies, you've now grown into a market that I think you look at as the model in the United States. Not that there aren't vehicles in other states, but I think we regularly now in the last 10 years, particularly the rating agencies, have issued reports and upgraded the credit of MUDs, Texas MUDs, and in fact have lauded the controls and said other states should look at those controls and maybe model them, because we hadn't had bankruptcies since then, and that's a huge deal. And that what that does is it has provided certainty and quality of credit in the market, which has caused lots of investment. Now, I think the attractiveness of the MUD debt, because of all those things, has also coincided with a huge economic boom. And we can talk about that sort of separately, but we always kid. I mean, the huge economic boom has driven municipal financings, and particularly MUD financings. I'm not so sure that MUD financings and the availability of that capital for the market in Texas development market hasn't also helped fuel the boom, because it has provided certain and regular supply of capital and certainty to developers and their lenders, frankly, and equity partners of return on their infrastructure costs. And that has also kept the price of housing. That's been a hallmark of Texas housing industry. It's affordability over the last 30 years. Now, the market right now with inflation and everything else is challenging everyone, including Texas, I think, in that regard. But that's certainly been part of the success.
Well, everybody, that concludes part one of my conversation with David Oliver from ABHR. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe wherever you get your podcast.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Follow us wherever you find your podcast to never miss a new episode.